Welcome everybody to the start of our seminar series on digital lives and human values. And in particular, a session we're going to have today, which I think will be very fascinating, which is looking both at international public opinion approaches to digital governance and AI. And then I think importantly, shifting to looking about what are the regulatory and practical implications of AI memory and AI memory at scale. And we've got two presenters today who are one is an old friend of the guide process and one is a new friend, a new member. Fen Hampson, the Chancellor Professor at Carlton University and the former Director of the Global Commission on Internet Governance. And Fen is joined by Josh Moffat. Josh is an alumni of Carleton University in Canada and is an AI architect and computer scientist who's heavily involved in one of the important startups in AI in Canada. And the two of them will be talking together on these issues. Everybody, we welcome you to this series. The series is geared and with help from our partners at My Data Global, the Global Solutions Initiative in Berlin, and the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Canada. And the series is directed towards both exploring policy and theoretical aspects around digital governance and the future of digital governance, but it's also directed towards the important aspects of how do practitioners actually make some of the principles we talk about come to life. And our seminars vary between those two. So let me get started and introduce Fen and Josh, and perhaps they can talk to themselves and tell us about the seminar. At the end of this session, we will then open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning if you're in the eastern seaboard of the United States. Good afternoon if you're in Europe, and good night if you're in Australia. I'd like to thank the organizers, Paul and Vicente, for the opportunity to share this work with you today. We're going to talk about not just public opinion, but how to govern AI memory to scale. A quick note at the outset, this is a work in progress. We're sharing it early because we want to benefit from the expertise of this distinguished group. I also want to thank my co-presenter, Josh, for his terrific work on this project, especially on the technical architecture and the pilot proposal that you're going to hear more about, which is behind some of the things you're going to hear about today. Finally, let me just say we'll welcome questions and feedback at the end of the presentation. Don't hesitate to be critical and offer your own suggestions, particularly on the feasibility of some of the ideas that we're going to put on the table today, governance issues and adoption. If we go to slide 3, just to give you a sneak preview of where we're going today. First, the problem. As AI systems become more useful, the memory layer, that is to say, the storage of user data, tends to centralize by default. And this creates 4 interlinked risks. Privacy risks, obviously, having to do with consumer data. What we're seeing in public opinion and erosion of public trust. Problems of monopoly control in terms of growing market concentration, and we'll have more to say about that. And then from a security standpoint, single points of vulnerability. We believe that the core solution to addressing some of these risks is architectural, and that involves at a fundamental level separating AI cognition functions from custody of data. Let AI models do the reasoning, but keep the user's memory under user control with access that is explicit, auditable, and revocable. And those principles are very much at the forefront of Guide's earlier work and the major report that Paul, Dennis, and many of the people here contributed to. So this shouldn't come as a big surprise. Third, on the how. We're not proposing a moonshot rewrite of AI and the internet. The idea we're going to put forward is to build on existing infrastructure using a universal memory protocol approach paired with familiar web plumbing and access tools so that AI models can securely pull the data they need for a particular task and then let go of that data. Fourth, on feasibility, we believe that the concept can be tested with a pilot. Josh will say more about that. A chatbot that uses an external memory store precisely to show that you can get utility without turning the model itself into a permanent data repository. The roadmap here or the end state is to get away from what we would call a winner-take-all silo approach to AI. What we need to be thinking about is a federated ecosystem of memory services with standardized interfaces so that users, organizations, and jurisdiction can choose where memory resides and under what regulatory framework or set of rules. If you take one line away from this presentation, it is this: we don't need to slow AI progress. We need to decide who owns its memory. I'll stop there. Josh is going to take you through the practical architecture and why we think this can be made real. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Fen. Before I get into the technical architecture, I just want to ground this in public sentiment because the core issue here isn't whether the technology works, it's whether people actually trust it. Ipsos has been doing, or they've been tracking public attitudes towards AI for a couple of years now. And the pattern's very consistent across countries, including Canada and Europe. People are broadly optimistic about what AI can do. That means productivity, efficiency, better services, but they're also deeply uneasy about how their data is being used and stored and reused over time. So trust tends to drop sharply when people believe that their personal information is being retained indefinitely or shared across systems or controlled by companies that they either don't understand or they can't meaningfully challenge in any way. And what's interesting is that this isn't a rejection of AI itself. It's a rejection of opaque data custody. So people are essentially saying, I'm okay with AI as a tool to help me, but I'm not okay with handing over my personal context over to these large AI providers. And this is where memory becomes the pressure point, because once AI systems start accumulating long-term personal context, the question stops being, is the output correct? And it starts being, who owns the profile that's being built around me? And that's why this matters for policy, because if we ignore this signal and focus only on model capability or the speed of innovation, then we risk building systems that are technically impressive, but also at their core very brittle. So on the other hand, if we design an architecture that aligns with these trust expectations where memory is explicit and user controlled, then we allow for more robust systems without having to slow down that AI adoption. So the key takeaway from this is it's not people are scared of AI, it's that trust now constrains AI adoption. And memory is one of the fastest ways to either rebuild or destroy that trust. So for most commercial AI providers today, user data is stored in centralized cloud infrastructure. That includes what we're now calling memory, which is persistent user context. So your preferences, history, behavioral signals, biometric data, all of that typically lives inside the AI platform itself. And it's rarely local to the user's device. And it's also not typically something that the user can explicitly control. Saying my AI knows me, what that really means is a platform owns an increasingly detailed profile of who you are and how you think and also how you behave. And this is where risk and power start to accumulate in a very specific way. You have increasingly powerful models, you have persistent user context, and you have proprietary platform silos that control both of those things. And when those three things come together, the platform is going beyond just providing those intelligent services. It now has the capability to mediate the relationship between the user and the rest of the world. And that's part of the reason why economic power and strategic leverage are starting to concentrate into those proprietary silos at increasingly dangerous levels as these AI platforms continue to improve and evolve. So it's quite obvious that the outcome there isn't accidental. There's very strong economic incentives for those platforms to vertically integrate across the entire stack. So from hardware to applications, all the way down to the user's personal memory. And if you own the memory layer, you can charge rents to every service that wants access to your user. So if a company wants to know who they should target their product marketing towards, these AI providers are able to give them incredibly valuable data on that because they have such deep and personal knowledge built up about their users, which they can use to exploit them, and they will use to exploit them. So even if not everyone has those bad intentions, the architecture itself pushes us in that direction. So right now, the default architecture looks like this. The user interacts with the AI running inside the AI platform, and the platform quietly captures and builds and governs the user's memory by default through the user interacting with the model. And there's no clear boundary where the user says, yes, you can keep this, or no, forget that, at least in most cases. So knowledge about the user just accumulates indefinitely. So at global scale, centralized memory creates single points of vulnerability. It erodes user trust over time, which we're already observing. And it concentrates sovereignty, not just data sovereignty, but decision-making power in the hands of those few platforms. And the risks I highlighted so far are really just the tip of the iceberg when you think about how such rich and dynamic personal data can be used by these platforms to exert control. So the honest truth is AI does not need to own memory in order to function. That is an architectural choice by the provider. It's not a technical requirement. So the solution and the alternative is to separate cognition from custody. So the AI remains stateless reasoning engine. Like Fen said, the user controls their memory, and access to that memory happens across an explicit auditable boundary. So if the AI requires information about the user for a task, it must explicitly request it across that line and then release it. So that's the idea behind what we're proposing as a universal memory protocol. So what that means is the AI remains stateless, the memory is user-controlled, access is explicit and revocable. So in essence, this creates a standard way for AI systems to request user context without retaining it. It does not replace AI systems or models. It only changes how they interact with personal data. So more importantly, this doesn't require any new global infrastructure to be built. We can use systems that are already trusted at internet scale. DNS already resolves identifiers to locations globally. It's been standard networking practice for a long time now. So in this model, DNS is used only to resolve where the user's memory service lives, not to carry or store data between the service and the model. So memory itself stays encrypted, and that access happens over secure HTTPS and TLS connections directly between the memory service and the AI system. So at the AI application layer, we already have something that works for this, which is Model Context Protocol, or MCP. And that's now a standard way for AI systems to use external tools. So to give you an example of MCP that you may have used is when you ask an AI model to schedule a meeting in your calendar. In order to do that, the AI makes a call to an MCP server that sits in front of your calendar app, and it performs the action that the AI model has requested. So you can think of it as a middleman between the AI model and the external service. So for us, MCP gives us a universal way for AI systems to interact with that external memory without having to own it. So end to end, the flow looks like this. The user explicitly allows the platform to access their personal context, then sends a prompt. The AI requests the location of the user's memory. DNS resolves where that memory lives. And then the AI retrieves the context via secure connection, performs the task, and returns the result to the user. And that entire time, the user's memory stays decoupled from the AI system or platform. So by shifting to this architecture, the user gets the exact same experience as before. They don't have to change their behavior. The AI provider gets reduced liability for that sensitive user data, and regulators get a clear and enforceable audit trail for that personal user context. So that kind of gives you an idea of the memory protocol in theory, but the best way to actually get the ball rolling is to build a pilot of the system with an intentionally small scope, as small as possible. So that means a small volunteer cohort, a lightweight chatbot interface with no persistent memory, a single MCP server exposing the user memory read and write tool to the chatbot so that you can have that memory be dynamic, and a single user-controlled memory store discoverable via that standard DNS. And ideally, this pilot can be built by a consortium of EU and Canadian universities, where we can validate this approach in a controlled environment before scaling it to broader deployment. So building that pilot is actually extremely simple and low cost, and it proves the point that AI works without owning memory. It proves that users retain control of their context, not the AI system, and no new infrastructure is required to support it. And we start small because the risk is low, deployment's fast, and the learning value of that is extremely high. So this pilot is a natural starting point to validate that the system can work in real life before scaling it up. So moving forward, once you have that pilot as a starting point, that means that scaling is federated, not centralized. You can start with a single region and then multiple regional memory services. And then once you've proven that it works at scale, you can then move towards that standardized interface for AI providers. So that's a blueprint for scaling this without concentrating control. Okay. And this works at scale because it's jurisdiction aware by default. It reduces single points of failure, and it actually improves innovation incentives rather than locking them inside a few dominant platforms that retain all the power. And we've actually seen this same pattern before with OAuth and TLS, which are standards that became widely adopted across the software ecosystem. And those are present in most of the web applications that you all use today. And the reason they were successful is because they didn't replace the platforms or the applications. They solved acute, unavoidable risks. They preserved that existing functionality without the users having to change their behavior. And they reduced the liability for operators. So AI memory is at a similar inflection point to that, because we don't need to replace AI systems. We need to address that growing risk that I highlighted. while preserving personalization and functionality, and also reducing long-term data liability. Back to you, Fen.
Yep, thanks. So this slide is about regulatory challenges. Josh has spoken about the technical architecture. And I think it's fair to say that too often in the regulatory world, regulators focus on firm size or the specific behavioral aspects or practices of firms. But the deeper question is whether the architecture, and by architecture, business models, are getting locked in, particularly through proprietary memory silos. So let me make a couple of key points. There's a structural risk. We could see a wave of proprietary platform silos where models, tools, and memory fuse into closed AI systems. And the earlier slide that we showed you of the stack, if you look at who the players are, the big players in that stack, it's pretty obvious that there is effort to get control over the entire stack by very big companies, and we all know who they are. If dominant firms own the memory layer, they, in effect, can charge toll booth rents to every downstream service that needs access to user content. And that's not just a privacy story, it's a competition and innovation story. If cognition and custody remain fused, competition is obviously foreclosed because rival firms can't compete without access to users' live content. So there are high barriers to entry in a silo AI world. The fix is not to break up the firms. It's an architectural unbundling proposal to separate cognition from data custody so memory is portable and governed independently. What stateless AI means is that you treat the LLMs as stateless reasoning engines. They receive the content through a secure temporary link. They complete the task and then they forget it. It's a variation, and I probably shouldn't use this metaphor, of the fire and forget principle. This approach can complement existing regulatory initiatives in the EU, particularly under the Digital Marketing Act, which imposes limits on cross-service data combination, makes it technically harder to aggregate what the model does not possess. Now, you might say this is all very well, but if it's technically feasible, why isn't there this kind of separation already in, for example, the social media space? The problem there has essentially been one of path dependency. You can, of course, separate computation from state, which is to say the stored information that persists over time and gets reused to shape what the system does. Social media didn't because the state, the social graphs, engagement histories, identity, DMs, inferred preferences, those are the assets that produce monopoly rents. Social media's advertising model rewards custody, better targeting and measurement that comes from owning the data exhaust. And secondly, network effects get supercharged by memory. If the platform holds your graph, your history, leaving it is costly, so competition is foreclosed. And thirdly, interoperability collides with governance. Who is responsible for harmful content, bot control, identity verification, and moderation if third parties can plug in? Incumbents often invoke trust and safety considerations to protect their monopolies, sometimes legitimately, but it also conveniently preserves locked in. And finally, policies have arrived too late and were narrowly focused on dealing with the problem downstream. Our argument is that AI is at a much earlier fork in this road. If we set standards now. Separate cognition from memory custody now. We can avoid repeating the social media path dependency problem. If we could go to the next slide. Now, if this were only a technical and regulatory design question, it would be hard to resolve, but not intractable. The biggest complication, I think we can agree, is a geopolitical one. To be candid, in a trade war environment, proposals to separate platform layers will be highly political charged. They already are, because large firms are seen as national champions. But there are also very high costs of inaction. If we do nothing, and by we, I mean Canada, Australia, European Union, we will effectively be granting outsized, unchecked power to whoever controls the memory layer, because those who do will become the de facto owners of digital identity and national memory at scale. The reality, though, is that no single country, no middle power, can shift the political equation on its own. We would argue the practical pathway has to be coordination among the EU, the UK, Australia, Canada, and other like-minded partners around interoperable standards and enforceable safeguards. If we try to go it alone, as we've done in the current trade wars, we will risk becoming digital colonies inside a vertically integrated empire, dependent on external custodians for memory that increasingly drives services and decisions in an AI world. So the choice is a stark one. Back to you, Josh.
So as Fen made clear, separating AI from memory is not free from challenges. It introduces questions around interoperability, latency, governance, and operational complexity. And those all have to be managed deliberately. So those are real engineering and coordination problems, but they're also problems that we know how to solve, provided we address them early rather than after those systems have already scaled up. So the larger risk here is that we delay examining alternatives while centralized memory becomes deeply embedded. And once that long-lived user context is tightly coupled to those small number of platforms, reversing that becomes economically and politically extremely difficult. So at that point, governance options, they would narrow significantly. So the core question then is whether AI personalization requires permanent centralized custody of user memory, or whether we should test architectures that separate capability from control while we still can. With that, I'd like to thank everyone again for the opportunity to have this conversation, and we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Fen. Very interesting presentation. I've got about 15 questions down here in front of me, but I know there'll be people on this call who would have a lot of interest in that. So I'm going to let people give a chance to think about it, put their hands up if they wish to ask a question. And while we're waiting for that, let me lead off with a couple of ones. It seems to me in what you're presenting is your focus is around the consumer, which is completely factors into what Guide and our partners are focused on. But your basic principle, to me, it seems to be is already in place when it comes to enterprises who are doing specialized, who are receiving or offering specialized RAG services to particular clients or segments. So a lot of the parties who are providing services to enterprises who are using their own data in a RAG to do that, the enterprise content doesn't go to the LLM. the enterprise content stays within the whatever the memory decision is of the certainly the content does, which people then do the iteration, stays within the context of the supplier, or even I can think of particular ones where a company that might be approaching a particular sector will ensure that the data from each one of its clients can never go with any other client. It's all kept very separate. And that stuff doesn't stay with the LLMs. It's brought into use. So it may not be, I may be getting some of that misconstrued, but it seems to me in the enterprise space, people are already in your basic principle, which is I'm not going to share my information and allow long-term understanding of my business and my key stuff back with an LLM.
Yeah, you're right. In the enterprise context, there is situations where it would remain, that context would remain within the organization. But just because you're using a RAG system doesn't mean that context isn't being sent to the model if you're using it. Because if you're retrieving context, even if it's from a set of documents that is within your organization, if it's retrieving context from them and sending it to the model, then the platform provider still has access to that data, no matter how small it may be or scoped.
Okay. Paul Mullen has his hand up, so we'll start with Paul.
So, first of all, I love this. This is, I think, very much in the right direction. Some questions around the edge of it. One is, it matters how the AI is trained, right? In this situation, we've controlled the data, but we don't know how the model is using the data. So an example of this background in ad tech is that you can take a set of innocuous looking data and then do a thing called fingerprinting and track someone with this data, even though it doesn't appear that there's any sort of identifiable ID in it. It uses like the set of all the data to create an ID and track you. So the model could very well be using the data against you, even though it could also be using it for a good purpose. How necessary is transparency into the training of the model?
Yeah, that's definitely a good concern. And I think it would be naive of us to think that when there's money to be made, that they're going to make the right decision and do the right thing. That's another reason why this is a good thing, to separate that personal context that can be used for ad tech, like you said, so that we can have an easier way to audit that, so that it's less of a black box when it comes to using personal user data to train models.
I think it might even mean that we have to have open source models so that the actual model can be audited.
Yeah, and there's the option of evaluations as well for auditing models. Open source is another route as well, but there's multiple ways to track and audit as well.
Or at least someone should be auditing the training, watching the training happen.
That also speaks to the value of having a pilot project, and maybe more than one pilot project, so that one can test the kinds of questions and assumptions that we all typically have. That's, I think, a good place to begin before going big.
Hey, B, you've got your hand up. Perhaps you can, if you're happy to put the screen on, you can ask the question.
He's muted.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, my camera doesn't seem to want to go on. Can you, Liza? Can you hear me?
That's fine. Just talk. That's great.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I'm a small startup, but about a year ago, we implemented our own vector memory tool for Claude, and we use it with open source. So we use LM Studio, and the LM Studio allows any model to use the MCP. And also, too, we developed a team version, which isn't quite finished. I abandoned it. But on a daily basis, I use the vector memory with Claude and basically say, Claude, please save this vector memory, synthesize the conversation, and it stores it. So it's tagged, so it can be indexed or whatever. On the team memory one, it's basically running on OpenShift as a service. So in other words, I'm using ChromaDB as the vector memory store, but basically it's pretty effective. I have a statistics tool, so it's about 100 milliseconds, and it's in terms of the vector memory, it's pegged in at 100% reliable. Yeah, I've been using it extensively as an epistemic tool, so that when the session runs out, you can come back a few days later and say, Claude, we're having a conversation, search vector memory, synthesize that, we'll review it, and then we'll proceed. So technically, it's not difficult.
Yeah, and that's interesting, by the way, but that's one way to address the problem of latency, like you said. One concern, though, is you want to avoid standardizing the way memory is stored. You want it to be as interoperable and universal as possible. And that's what the pilot brings value towards. If you can hash these problems out in a really small scoped controlled environment, then it makes it a lot easier to hash those problems out before you start scaling this system.
Yeah, in our client library, you can change to whatever vector encoding that you want. You can define the conversational stores as team or personal or whatever that you want. Out of the box, it's not completely flexible, but so on our team version, we have the concept of a team vector memory, but also we retain the personal conversational memory.
Okay, that's
So
great.
I'm just basically
sorry.
saying what you want to do is eminently doable.
That's very good. Can I just go to Paul Verhoef and then Dennis?
Yes, good afternoon. It's good to see all of you. Thanks, Fen and Josh, for this. I find this a very interesting idea. I'd like to approach this a bit from the user side, so to speak, rather than from the AI model side, particularly if we're going to do pilots. And it concerns particularly the organization of the memory. On the one hand, you could think the memory could stay on personal computers of people and they could do it from there. This for the regulator will not be easy to have access and check the interface. If you, on the other hand, you can go to the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, and organize memories. Presumably, this would, by and large, with the exception of the EU, you would have to do this on a national basis if you want the regulator to provide to have access to the interface, verify that it all works. You don't want one of the countries where the AIs are based to say, yeah, we can separate all this, but the memory has to be in my country. That is not going to work. So by definition, this introduces an extraterritorial component to all of this. But the question is, how would this be organized? As a user, I will probably want to use quite a number of AIs. So would I need to be in multiple memories, or can I use my own computer for this? Or have you considered any of this, how this is going to have to work in practice? Or is this what the pilot will have to sort out and give guidance on how to organize all this? Because there are the three parties. I think the AI model side is in a way the easiest, and I understand your use of DNS and makes it very simple for that side. The question is on the regulatory side on one hand, and on the user side in particular, on the individual user side, how is this going to work? Also the question, if there are central memories, do you foresee this to be a service? Would I need to pay extra for that, or how is this going to work? Thanks.
Those are all very,
yeah, go ahead.
Those are all very good practical questions. And what we're arguing here is for a phased approach. First of all, let's see if technically what theoretically makes sense is actually doable. And for the engineers in the room, you all know that when you scale things up, things can actually change. There are scaling challenges, which argues strongly for a pilot that may operate at different scale levels. But I would say, in terms of the questions you raised, Paul, about memory storage, there I would say we're likely to see, as we already see in different jurisdictions, a combination of what I would call free market state and state free market approaches to it, depending on what the needs of the consumer are, what the needs of the business community are, what the needs of the public sector are. I think that the value of this exercise is that, and we're seeing this in Canada right now, our prime minister gets very excited, and I don't mean this as a criticism, when he talks about data sovereignty, because Microsoft is going to set up cloud computing services in the physical territory of Canada. A lot of us are just scratching our heads and saying, that's not sovereignty. You're not getting any kind of control there. Real sovereignty from both the consumer and a state vantage point is having greater degrees of control over your data and how it's used. And I think the value of this approach is that, and Josh touched on it in the presentation, if you go to this model, you can actually audit what's going on because you see it. Right now, we don't see it. And that's part of the problem. It's part of the reason why the public doesn't trust this stuff, very skeptical of technology. But I also think, to come back to something I said earlier, we better get our act together. When I say we, the community of like-minded countries, to really zero in on the problem that is identified here. If we don't do it now, and if we let the Americans push us around on this, or the Chinese for that matter, I see Sherry has a question about China, we're going to be on the receiving end again. And it's not just in terms of who controls the data of Europeans or Canadians or Australians, but there's a huge knock-on effect in terms of where the money is to be made in the AI business, which is in the application layer of AI. And our companies will be once again at a real competitive disadvantage if the big firms are essentially controlling the stack and charging rents on that data.
Let's move to Dennis. Dennis, you're on mute.
I have two short questions. First of all, I believe that addressing the consumer is absolutely central because the system is meant to serve the interests of the consumer. So if we had a system where only business interests were served, even if they were properly served, that would still be far from the optimal arrangement. Now, in the absence of agreement geopolitically on these issues, how do you imagine that the digital ecosystem of the world will evolve if you have a number of like-minded countries who take your advice and move in the direction that you suggest, whereas other countries, United States, China, move in different directions? Do you have any idea as to how that world will look? And who will be at a social, political, and economic advantage and disadvantage? And the second question is, can we think of different development paths for AI in which, if this like-minded country approach succeeds, the way AI develops will be different along different lines from the way AI develops in China or in the United States. And in this area, obviously, maximum information extraction is not necessarily in the public interest. So do you have any ideas about what the development paths that are relevant for these different scenarios may look like?
I would say at the outset that collectively, the European Union, Canada, Australia, possibly Japan, Korea, we have monopsony power because we're major consumers of what's coming out of the United States right now. But the only way we're going to exercise that monopsony power is if we do it together. collectively and to coordinate. If we take the approach, which is the one we have taken up to now in the tariff wars with Trump, the Americans will pick us off one by one. But if we do it together and stand up to them and say, this is going to be the regulatory framework. This is where we're going with it. And if you want to do business with us, you got to play by our rules. You're in a much stronger position. There's absolutely no question about it, because they need those markets. When it comes to the Chinese, I hate to say it, Josh, but the Chinese will love this model for fairly obvious reasons. But they've been moving in that direction anyway. They have very strong rules about data localization, data portability, and they're going to exploit this technology. But I think the message to them is, if you want to play in our markets, you got to play by our rules. And so you're not going to be able to have the fusion of memory and cognitive power in the same company. Sure, you can have your stateless AI models, right? DeepSeek, fine, right? But there's going to be a very strong audit trail when you access a memory function to do your processing. So I think, to come back to the inflection point, we really are at an inflection point. It's a horrible time to be at an inflection point because we're being beaten around the legs with Trump's tariffs. And he is picking us off one by one. But if there's one sector in terms of the future economic health of our economies where we need to act together, I would say this is it. And there's certainly leadership in Canada that understands it. We have a new AI minister. We have a prime minister who is very keen on cooperating with Europe. And I think in Europe, I can't speak for the Europeans, but we are seeing a much stronger capacity for collective action in the security space. And this is one issue that needs to be put front and center on the agenda in a way that is accessible for experts listening to this presentation. Oh yeah, we get it, but it's got to be simplified and dumbed down for the politicians so they understand what the real problem and policy challenge is here. And that's where I think this group can play a very important role.
Could I just ask,
Sorry.
could I just ask, do you have any of what you've just said in writing that you could send off so that we can mull over it a little more?
Yeah, we can share the deck with you, obviously. Josh and I have written a little paper that we can share with you. It's a very simple paper, but this is the first cut. We have it out to some members of our group who aren't here, to put a second set of eyes on it. And we are going to be sharing it with our own government people, because I think we've been struck by the fact that the conversation is very much, the policy conversation is very much in what I would call the downstream area of AI. AI doing bad things, to children and manipulation of consumers and all that stuff. We, as Paul and I have talked about this endlessly, you need to go upstream. You need to go upstream if you're really going to get a handle on these issues.
I was just going to say quickly, and just the simple politics getting attention, children is the place where people seem to understand and be able to make the point that this is children's data will be held the same way. At the same time, when a lot of markets are running around thinking that what they want to do is try to make it easy to have AI adoption because they all see productivity. And the Australian policy discussion in the last several weeks has reflected an about turn on that hinge. When the Europeans are saying, it also reminds me that if you look at the most recent vote in Switzerland around AI, the population only just voted. And so their concerns are real. So there's some interesting issues there. I'm going to ask Peter Alexiades, and then I'm going to ask Paul Mullen again.
Thanks, Paul. Some great propositions put forward today. I'm want to just explore one point on this need for a sort of broad-based international coalition, only because I'm concerned that Trump has made it quite clear just last week that anybody, first of all, is very angry with the European Union for continued enforcement of the DMA and the DSA. And they've already threatened trade sanctions as a response thereto. But at the back part of the document where they threatened that, they also said in no uncertain terms that anybody else following the EU's lead will be punished accordingly. So in light of that, given that there might be some faint hearts around the place, would it be possible for the EU to lead itself? Is it a big enough market, do you believe, on its own to allow other parties like the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians to play more of a waiting game, to say, let's see if there's some traction here, and then we'll join up rather than sticking our necks above the parapets early on? I personally think there is, but I don't have any data which would support the view that the European market is so non-negotiable that US digital giants would fall in line.
So I did throw into the chat some more public opinion data that was the basis of a presentation we gave a couple of, I guess, months ago now at McGill University. And what's interesting, there is not a huge variation between the way the American public feels about the issues we've been talking about and the Europeans. Historically, we've thought that there's a big divide here. Guess what, folks? There isn't. And when you actually do a deep dive into the numbers and look at the variations, they're not statistically significant. Europeans, North Americans, and by that, Americans and Canadians and Mexicans are all on the same song sheet, right? Concerns about privacy, big tech, and control. Politically, Trump is in lockstep with the big tech bros, but the public is not behind them. So, point number one. Point number two, the business community in Europe better get serious about this, because they are going to be whipsawed by this technology if we allow the business models that are developing in their current form to essentially have oligopolistic over AI through the entire stack. And they are going to be screwed. They are going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And so I think, number one, it's not just governments have to wake up to this, but the private sector has to wake up to this. And business labor groups as well, for all the reasons that Guide's earlier work showed, and consumers. And to come back to something I said earlier, Europe has monopsony power here in this space. It's one of the reasons why there's been such a powerful Brussels effect globally, is because of Europe's monopsony power in the regulatory space. So my advice is, don't be pushed around by these guys. Trump's political fortunes are already beginning to wane. And if ever there was a time to come together and say, we're not going to take it anymore, it's now, and it's on this issue.
Okay, we have a question from Sherry, and I might just read it. The question is, would the use of OpenAI, as China does, have any implications around the architecture proposed and governance implications of this proposed proposal?
Josh, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Sorry, could you just repeat the last part, Paul?
Yes, it says, would the use of OpenAI as China, and I think maybe it's or the China one, does it have any implications around the architecture proposed and governance implications of this proposed approach? I suppose the question essentially, the various LLMs, does they really affect the architecture proposed?
Yeah, so I think Fen made a good point that the Chinese would definitely love this model because it would be state controlled on their end to give the state better auditability for users' behavior rather than the platform. But to answer your question, Sherry, this is designed to be interoperable between any AI model, and that's why we're proposing MCP, the Model Context Protocol, because any AI model can make a tool call to your memory. It's a universal gatekeeper in front of your store of user context that reads and writes memory to your memory store. For China's context, whatever models that they choose to use, whether it's OpenAI's or their own proprietary models, they can use a similar system to this, which I'm sure they've already looked at and are developing, to exert greater control at a state level over the population.
Can I just clarify the memory? When KB gave an example of using local memory, but the memory wouldn't have to be local. You could have basic cloud instances or other things that are actually their job is to look after your personal data, and one cloud instance then talks to the model and back. So it's not just that it has to sit in my laptop or sit on my phone.
Yeah, so I think the other Paul had asked that question as well, which I meant to answer, but it does not matter where the memory lives. It can live anywhere. That's the system we've designed. It's designed for interoperability at every level. So you can have the user context be on your local machine, or you can have it in a cloud environment or a sovereign data center. What we've designed is meant to give people the choice to decide where that user memory should live and where best suits the needs for governing and auditing that user context.
And Paul Mullen, that's a good segue for you to ask your next question.
Yeah, so I'll reverse the order I was going to ask this in, but as far as where the data goes, I think of course, it's in some ways easier to do it in the cloud, somewhere a secure cloud, whatever it is, a Web 3.0 solution to that, but it might be difficult to explain to users that, okay, your data is being taken, but trust us that we're handling it correctly, unlike everyone else. So it might be easier to explain to users if they have physical control of their own data. And the other point I was going to make is, so the adoption problem, several people mentioned this is very feasible technically, but is it feasible? Like, how can we get people to go down this path when they have such a large incentive to hold on to the data and extract value from it for themselves? And I think that's a problem, but there's also a strength in there in that they are restricting access to the data. So if it was possible to build this data repository or some sort of massive data that's available to AIs under your rules, and that was a level playing field, then that would be an incentive to adopt the rules to get the data, right?
I guess my response to that would be, this is good old-fashioned competition policy. You can't, as a company, be controlling everything from extraction to distribution to refining. And so those tools exist. They certainly exist in Canada. They exist in the European Union. Can't speak for the United States. They do everything there through the courts. It's messy. It's kind of case by case. But I think we already have the regulatory instruments. And the issue is one of political will to say, is this what we really want? Is this what we really want? And I think it's important to lay it out to the policymakers that the reason we have competition policy is to prevent the multinationals from killing your own business in this space. It's that simple.
Okay, let me quickly move on to KB. Your hand's still up. Have you got a follow-up question?
No, sorry, I forgot to take my hand down. Excuse me. Pardon.
That's no problem. Vicente, you've got a question?
Yeah, I have three silly questions actually. The first one, Josh and Fen, if you can explain just for recording purposes, why this system is still fast, even though you're adding another layer. The second one is, if I understand correctly, for every app or every AI system, you would need some way to transfer all the data that is being created to a central database. Is that correct? And the third one is, let's assume in 5 more years that this model scales. How does other markets work? For example, real-time bidding and the insurance market would work if this was fully applicable.
I guess I'll answer the first two and then Fen maybe take the third one. But yeah, so for this living in a central database, yes, that's the goal. And there are concerns about latency for sure. Right now, that user memory lives within the platform silo, which we talked about in the presentation, but that means that you don't have to go anywhere to retrieve that data. And what we're introducing, you would have to go somewhere to grab that, whether it's a regional data store or wherever it's chosen to live, which inherently introduces latency. But again, the purpose of the pilot is to experiment and test whether that latency can be viable and negligible in certain situations or in general, and to reduce that as much as possible so that you're not having to affect the experience of users, which is another reason why things like these tend to fail, because users have to change their behavior. So we're trying to avoid that and ensure that this can be adopted with as little hassle as possible from every end.
Can I just interrupt on that? The chairman's prerogative. Can I just clarify? The memory that you're talking about that can be held by the consumer or held in another, either individually on their site or chosen joint site. Are we talking GPUs or other forms of memory chips here?
Sorry, by memory, I'm talking about personal user context, not hardware.
Let's take it to hardware. What's the hardware you would need to have?
You're not doing any inference computing, so you would not need GPUs for that. It's living in a database, and you're retrieving that data from the database, and then the computing is still done by the platform using the platform's hardware.
So the allies for this could be the people who still produce memory capacity at the local level, which is not the inference chips. And the other allies would be the ISPs, who can see more data being shifted around from households, where they can increase sales of bandwidth to make the system with less latency. So you can see business allies for this in the tech stack already. So are you going to answer the other question?
What was the other one?
How does other digital markets look if this scales? Real-time bidding, insurance, data brokers?
Hard to say, but I think you would certainly see market segregation there in terms of memory storage, quite likely. It's hard to say. I think this is where Dennis and his fleet of economists would want to look at how our cost-benefit ratios changed as you move to a distributed memory network. It's not just a technical issue in terms of latency. I think it's probably fair to say it will drive up costs because there may be reduced economies of scale there. But by the same token, you may be getting, and this is something, Josh mentioned to me earlier, you may actually be getting in those different memory cores, if I can use that term, much higher quality data because it's being curated. Right now, it's a big scrub. It's why some of these models are considered to be dubious, because they're essentially scraping data from all kinds of different sources. As you move to a distributive network where there's, by definition, quality control, the models may actually work better in terms of
I can
do.
One of the things I can see, ironically, is the guide principles over a long period of time have said that we're concerned about the role for data brokers, not just the platforms, but for the many data brokers who shift data around ways we don't know. But the irony of what you're proposing is the industry structure changes over time such that there are only 5 data brokers, they're all the LLMs. The data brokers no longer have a job because the LLMs have all the inference, they have all the knowledge, all the memory, and they're the ones who are going to sell that information back to the marketplace.
Yeah,
So
well,
the
that's
existing
where
community,
yeah,
the
that's where
existing community of the existing community of data brokers could well become the allies for this model, especially if the consumer has the ability to make choices. Then they're the ones who are going to be saying, "Can I sign up you and offer you services?" Because the actually existing community of data brokers are probably the allies towards having this sort of a model.
yeah, exactly. And what at the end of the day, what are they selling? They're selling privacy, they're selling security. As Josh said, when you've got basically one cloud and one LLM, you've got single points of failure there. And so a distributed network or model here, you could say there are multiple points of failure, but it doesn't tend to have the catastrophic effects that you see when there's a major single point of failure. So I think you're absolutely right, Paul. They're very powerful economic incentives here because you're creating a competitive market, right? There's going to be competition, and that's a good thing. When you go to oligopoly, there's no competition and things get sloppy. We've seen that time and time again with market concentration, right?
I think that's a perfect statement to finish our seminar on. I'd like to thank Ken and Josh in particular for a very thoughtful presentation, and it's great that people have shared it. You've shared it now, thinking in action. It's still, as you say, work in progress. Thank you to the community who participated in this. I think we'll get a lot of interest in this, and hope that people who now look at this online and you've got an interest to ask more questions. I think that would be, when you see this video, if you've got other questions, come and participate in the guide community and ask and get engaged. I think that's going to be very important. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in several weeks' time, talking through the practical ways of making human-focused approaches to digital economy.